I think it's fair to say that I enjoyed Titanfall 2's campaign from its very start, but it wasn't until I played Into the Abyss that I began to realise just how special the game truly is. The mission is an extravagantly designed piece of gaming brilliance, which pushes you to begin playing Titanfall 2 just that little bit quicker in a setting which keeps you guessing at every turn. And in this video, I'm going to talk a bit more about why it's so wonderful. As always, let's begin with a very speedy recap of events in Titanfall 2 prior to the start of Into the Abyss. Militia rifleman and pilot in training Jack Cooper lands on the planet of Typhon as part of a militia assault on the Interstellar Manufacturing Corporation. The mission doesn't exactly go according to plan, with Cooper's mentor Ty Lastimosa killed during battle. Cooper becomes the new pilot of Lastimosa's Titan, BT-7274, and together the pair begin their journey to fulfill Special Operation 217, which tasks Lastimosa with rendezvousing with Major Eli Anderson. After fighting through a water reclamation facility and taking down apex predator Kane, Cooper and BT arrive at the outskirts of an IMC factory, which marks the beginning of Into the Abyss. I think in terms of dialogue, Into the Abyss may well be my favourite mission in all of Titanfall 2, and there's a couple of examples of why it's so great right at the beginning of the level that it's very easy to miss. First, if you decide to jump into the water.
Jump in, BT. The water's fine.
Recreational activities are non-essential to the mission.
And also this next line.
Watch your step.
Which it's worth noting also changes depending on whether you're in BT or not.
Watch our step.
These are small touches by themselves, but Titanfall 2 is a game littered with small touches like these, and honestly, I think they're a huge part of the game's charm. There's not much else to see during these opening moments, but it isn't long before you come across the Scorch loadout, which I'll come back to very shortly. This discovery is followed by another piece of dialogue, this time between Blisk and Ash, courtesy of the radio taken from Kane at the end of the previous mission, Blood and Rust. I said that Into the Abyss is my favourite level in terms of dialogue, and the radio messages you can eavesdrop on are one of the biggest reasons why. Ash is also perhaps the most entertaining of the Apex predators, something developer Respawn Entertainment may themselves agree with, given she's become a fairly big part of Apex Legends lore, and the relationship between Cooper and BT is still new enough at this point in the campaign that their communication is not quite as friendly as it will be in a few missions' time, which I think makes it particularly entertaining to listen to. Moving deeper into the facility, you'll no doubt spot quite a significant amount of Reapers, an early warning sign that they might just make an appearance later on, as well as pairs of trees being taken somewhere. Both definitely give you something to think about, but not for too long, as you're soon thrown into the mission's first combat encounter. Earlier you picked up the Scorch loadout, and the first few areas featuring combat do feel like they were designed with the loadout in mind. The long stretches ahead of you are perfect for using Firewall, which launches, you guessed it, a wall of fire in enemies' directions, and there's plenty of nooks and crannies which are perfect for grenade fire or incendiary traps. Scorch is a loadout which is most dangerous at short ranges and in tight spaces, and Respawn wants you to understand that, with Into the Abyss's opening arenas designed around its strengths. I mean, just look at this corridor and tell me it's not been designed with Scorch in mind. However, I also think this next area is an absolutely terrible one for using Scorch in. It's vast, it's open, and you now have to deal with IMC Titans as well as infantry. If those first few areas were designed to show you how effective Scorch can be in the right circumstances, then I like to think this one is laid out the way it is to show you how ineffective it can be in the wrong circumstances. I've no definitive proof that this was what Respawn was thinking, but I feel like the sudden shift from narrow corridors to a wider area is a good enough indication that they at least may have been. After taking down what feels like an army of IMC troops, BT is suitably impressed.
Enemy Titan down. Good work, pilot. Your skills are greatly improving.
He also refers to you as Pilot, which he does again a few moments later.
Pilot, this loading dock's cargo lift offers a shortcut through the facility. Check your HUD for the control panel.
This will become relevant again in just a second, but first you have to quickly visit a control room in order to raise a cargo lift. By the time you get back to BT, he has been captured, and as he's been taken away, he says this.
Pilot, I cannot free myself. Cooper.
Now, I could be wrong, but I believe this is the first time in the entire campaign that BT calls you Cooper. What I love about this is that it's one of the best examples of how well Respawn managed to balance BT being a robot with him also being a character with emotions of his own who you can actually relate to. As he's carried away, he appeals to you not by your role but by your name, frantically appealing to your human side, something he begins to do more often from this point onwards. By the time the campaign reaches its second half, Cooper and BT's relationship will be far stronger than it is here, but I think the very first signs of a relationship beginning to form are during Into the Abyss. Arriving at the World Foundry itself, the first thing you'll no doubt notice is the frankly absurd scale of the place. As I mentioned during the introduction, Into the Abyss was when it started to become clear to me just how brilliant Titanfall 2's campaign really is, and exploring the Foundry was a huge part of that. Straight away, you can tell it's an environment which has clearly had a lot of love put into it, and the dedication to creating such a well-realised space which will only actually be used for 10 to 15 minutes or so is very impressive, and this extends to how the level is designed as well. What I love about Titanfall 2 is how fluid its movement mechanics are, to the point where I think you could remove the enemies from a lot of scenarios and I'd still have a great time playing it like a first-person platformer. And it seems as if Respawn may have recognised that too, as Into the Abyss's level design does at its core feel a little like what you'd find in a platformer. Other levels in Titanfall 2 feel like slightly more realistic locations which have also been designed to emphasise movement, whereas the Foundry is full of floating platforms and shifting scenery, very much like the levels you'd navigate in a traditional Mario or Sonic title. There are still plenty of enemies for you to fight, but they're nothing you haven't seen before, and I don't consider them to be much more than window dressing. Sure, they help keep those who prefer the more action-packed parts of the game engaged, but the real star of the show here is the movement mechanic. If Blood and Rust's finale was a major hint that the mechanic is as fundamentally important to the Titanfall 2 experience as combat is, then Into the Abyss is very much the proof. Being good at combat and having a very basic understanding of the game's movement was enough to get you by up until this point, but from here on out, you really need to be fairly good at both in order to get by. I know it's not the most analytical way of describing things, but to put it simply, this section is just incredibly fun. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that it's one of the most entertaining sections in the entirety of Titanfall 2. You spend a good 10 minutes or so jumping from platform to platform and weaving between cover, with very little in the way of interruptions other than the occasional momentary pause while moving between firefights, and all this takes place in an environment with far more options than anything you've experienced up until this point. Previous missions were relatively narrow affairs, and it was usually very obvious where you were meant to go next, whereas the Foundry is an enormous playground. You learn the basics in more controlled environments during earlier missions, and Respawn then gives you a lot more freedom to figure out the best path of progression by yourself. It's one of the longest uninterrupted gameplay sections during Titanfall 2's campaign, and perhaps also its most open. Combat and movement are so intertwined that there's very little opportunity to focus on just one or the other, and every time you think you've reached the end of the gauntlet, a new set of platforms and a new platoon of enemies appears to dial the action back up to 11 once again. It's incredibly intense and incredibly entertaining in equal measure. Eventually, however, it does come to an end, although thankfully proceedings don't slow down for long at all. But before we move on, I again just want to quickly highlight the dialogue between Cooper and BT.
Pilot, are you alright?
Barely. That was a meat grinder. You okay?
I'm undamaged. However, I do not believe this is a food processing plant.
My luck, this place is gonna turn itself inside out.
Or upside down, considering the circumstances.
It's another short but wonderfully written exchange, which again demonstrates that the pair are becoming closer. You'll soon notice the structures turned on their side as you approach them, and if you're anything like me, you were desperate to climb them, which you get to do just seconds later. Again, this only serves to highlight Titanfall 2's platforming credentials, and I think the very brief moment when you run along a wall with everything turned on its side is one of the most memorable parts of the entire campaign. And if I'm being totally honest, this section is so much fun, I would have liked it to have lasted just a minute or two longer than it does. Reaching the simulation dome, a prefabricated arena is created around you as Ash continues to taunt Cooper.
Now, we shall see how impressive you truly are.
And it's here I want to talk briefly about how hilariously evil a villain Into the Abyss makes the IMC out to be. I don't mean hilariously in a bad way either. Titanfall 2 is a fairly stylized game, and the IMC are a fairly stylized enemy. No, I use the word hilariously because I always find it funny how outrageously terrible they actually are. Think about it, they've built an absolutely enormous factory with the sole purpose of creating vast numbers of homes and other buildings, not to help people, but to blow up during combat tests. And as if that wasn't enough, they also have no qualms about using prisoners of war as part of those tests when the opportunity arises. The conflict between the militia and the IMC could have maybe been seen prior to this mission as primarily a difference in ideologies, but fighting off waves of spectres, reapers, and eventually human troops, it becomes apparent, if it hadn't already, that they are straight up evil, which is also emphasised soon after when Ash announces that the entire facility will be destroyed.
To all IMC personnel, this is Ash. I am sorry to report due to your inability to contain the security breach, I have been forced to scuttle the entire complex. Some of you may consider this overkill. It is. I suggest you evacuate.
This is followed by another short but sweet platforming sequence which I'm a huge fan of, and an encounter with some ticks. I'll talk about the ticks a little more when I cover the mission Blood and Rust separately, but a quick note here, I really dislike their use as an enemy in scenarios like this. They are great in certain encounters, like the end of Blood and Rust, as their design is actually rather clever in that they encourage you to keep moving around, but here, where there's no real movement options on offer, I don't feel like their inclusion is a necessary one. Reunited with BT, the next few areas are fairly run-of-the-mill encounters, although I do like how you move between another dome and the area behind it as the facility begins to fall apart, and the area where you fight Ash is equally impressive as you brawl between crumbling structures with explosions lighting up the background. Ash is a fairly entertaining boss battle thanks to her Ronin loadout, and I'm really glad this isn't the last we saw of her. Like most of the Apex Predators, she is something of a cartoon baddie, but for my money she may be the most entertaining of them all, although you could make a strong case for Viper as well. Ash seemingly cares less about helping the IMC and more about having her fun with Cooper and BT, and I think this makes her a little less one-dimensional than some of the other Predators. Once Ash has been dispatched, until her reappearance in Apex Legends at least, there's one final tongue-in-cheek line from BT.
Pilot, I have concluded we should take no further shortcuts.
And Into the Abyss reaches its conclusion. Into the Abyss is awesome. Its middle section is, for my money, one of the very best in the entire game, and it features a villain who does a great job of adding a little extra personality during proceedings. And in terms of level design and the sheer amount of freedom it affords you, it's Titanfall 2 at its most unique and brilliant. Not only does it showcase Respawn's ability to hand new gameplay options to you at just the right moment, but it also makes a very strong case for Titanfall 2 having the best first-person movement mechanics in the entire genre. Other missions may get more attention for a variety of reasons, but Into the Abyss is the mission where, for me at least, everything the game does so well came together for the first time in perfect harmony. Cheers for checking out the video, boys, girls and pilots. If you enjoyed it, do consider liking and letting me know your thoughts, and maybe even subscribing as it all helps the channel, and hopefully I'll catch you all again soon.